Good morning, my friends, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I am Kori Schake, and it is my good fortune to lead the Foreign and Defense Policy team here at the American Enterprise Institute. We are an institution dedicated to three fundamental principles: to defending human dignity, expanding economic opportunity, and making the world a freer and safer place. And so it is natural that we are a fostering community in support of Ukraine, which is a state and a people dedicated to those same principles, and now nearly 4 years fighting to preserve them in their country. So it's an especial pleasure this morning for us to celebrate Ukraine looking toward the future. Because what I notice in the Washington policy debate is that there are a lot of outdated assumptions about who Ukrainians are and how Ukraine is working. And the people we have gathered here today are going to smash through those preconceived notions with the work they are doing on Ukraine's vision for the future and with their engagement with several FDP AEI scholars, Dalibor Rohach, Angela Stent, and Senator Rob Portman. So it's my great pleasure now to hand it over to Dalibor to get this moving.
Kori, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and good morning, everybody. It's great to welcome you all to AEI. I won't take too much time or space, indeed. I just wanted to make a few housekeeping remarks, introduce our friends from Ukraine, from the Ukrainian Institute of the Future. Anatoly Amelin will say a few words about his organization, and we'll also hear from Senator Portman before jumping straight into our first panel. So in terms of housekeeping, I have one piece of bad news, and then I have a couple of pieces of good news. The piece of bad news is that Ambassador Stefan Nishina, unfortunately, is stuck on the other side of the Atlantic as her flight was cancelled last night. So if you came for the ambassador, you might walk out disappointed. You can still head for the exits. It's a free country, but hopefully we can keep you entertained throughout this morning, regardless. The good news is that we have an extra speaker on the second panel that will focus on economic development and business in Ukraine. I'll introduce him in due course, and we'll also have Ihor Baranetsky from the Ukrainian embassy, who will wrap up the conversation for us at 11:45. So after the first panel, we'll make just a quick shift from one panel to the next, and we'll continue our conversation until 11:45. So that's the housekeeping I have here. I'll hand it over to Anatoly in a second for a brief pitch about his organization. And he'll be followed by Senator Portman, who has had a distinguished career in public service for over 3 decades, worked for 3 presidential administrations, served in both houses of the US Congress, has a track record as a very successful legislator, working across the aisle, having his legislation signed by Presidents Biden, Trump, and Obama over the years, and obviously also playing a pivotal role in mobilizing support for Ukraine and leading the effort to ensure that Ukraine not only prevails in its existential struggle, but also that it is turned into a success story once this war is over. So we are delighted to have him at the conference. We are even more thrilled to have him as one of our fellows here at AEI. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. Now over to you, Anatoly, and then we'll hear from Senator Portman. Thank you.
A little nervous, sorry. More than 36 hours was trip from Ukraine to Washington. Unfortunately, no, we don't have flight in Ukraine because just in January, more than 6,000 drones was attacked Ukraine almost 200 missiles also was launched to Ukraine. Our energy infrastructure dramatically destroyed. We lost approximately 9 gigawatts of electricity, and we won't bring to USA big party of our books of vision of Ukraine till 2035. Unfortunately, we print a few books, but if you have phone, please, you can scan this QR and you can load this book in online version in PDF. You can scan. It's not for selling, it's just for your using. Please do it. Few words about our organization. Ukrainian Institute for the Future, it's one of the leading Ukrainian think tanks which was established 10 years ago for creating government policies. And today we have more than 15 government policies which adopt, including Ukraine strategy till 2030. We one of organizations who creates this document, and more than 20 different strategies for corporation, for private organization, for region, and etc. Our goal is create the best scenario for Ukraine. Vision of Ukraine to 2035, it's second document. First one was printed 6 years ago, and it was based of Ukraine strategy, which was adopted of Prime Minister of Ukraine in 2021. And now we are working for the future. We research big number of international foresight, forecast, and global documents. We understand what challenges our world will meet next 10 years, and also Ukraine part of this meet. At firstly, we won't present vision here, but the main question, why Americans and America should interest in vision of Ukraine? We have almost 200 countries in the world. Ukraine, one of them. Biggest part of the country has own strategy, own vision. Ukraine also have. What's the focus? Why Ukraine should be interesting for America? And we have answer. We research current strategical documents of America. Just a second. National security strategy, national defense strategy, NDAA, budget request for this year, and also mandate for leadership 2025. And we understand all risks and challenges which America will meet next 5-10 years. And you will be shocked, but Ukraine can solve big part of these problems, these challenges. It's critical raw materials, it's production of defense, it's security, it's energy. And our vision, it's not just vision of Ukraine, it's vision how we can give benefits our partners. I'm talking about European Union and also USA, because we understand without help of USA, today Ukraine was totally destroyed. And thank your country, thank your people, thank your president, thank you for your taxpayers, for your help for our country. And here, my family live in Kyiv. My little child, 2 years old, he lives in Kyiv in this terrible time. And we really want to thank you, American citizens, American people, for your support. Today, I will take a panel. I will not make presentation. I will share with organization, with American Enterprise Institute, our presentation. If you will be interested, I ask colleagues send it. But I will stop because a lot of words. Thank you.
Anatoly, thank you very much. And thank you for my own copy of the book, which I made him sign. So this morning I woke up and I'd heard the news late last night of the latest Russian attacks on Ukraine, and in particular an attack on a coal mine where 12 miners were killed, an attack on a maternity hospital where many were injured, including patients and nurses and doctors. And I couldn't find in the mainstream media any mention of it. And I thought, you know, I have to go to ISW to find this, the Institute of War, which is connected with AEI. But this is the sad situation that we're in, is that we're losing interest. Partly it is just fatigue, I imagine. So this morning, I thought we should start off with just a quick moment of silence for those victims of the continued illegal, totally unprovoked, and brutal attack on Ukraine. Let's take a moment of silence on behalf of those lost in the last 24 hours. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for standing and the respect that that shows. Thank you to AEI. I'm a fellow at AEI. I'm proud to be here. Dolabar, thank you for putting this together. This was your brainchild. Corey spoke earlier. Some of you know Fred Kagan. I mentioned ISW, also connected with AEI. So they're doing a lot of good work to try to encourage good scholarship and ensure that the American people know what's going on in Ukraine. The question that Dolabar asked me to answer this morning was, why does Ukraine matter? Why should we care about what happens to Ukraine? Some could say I'm biased in answering that question. I've been to Ukraine 15 times since I went as an election observer in 2014. Some of you know that was a monumental election. It was right after the Maidan. It was a time when Ukraine was looking to Europe and to the United States for their future, not to the East. It was a time for the United States to stand up and be counted. Since being there those 15 times, I've also gotten to know a number of people in this room and, of course, a lot of Ukrainians in Ohio. So you could say I'm biased, yes, but I'm going to answer the question given me as objectively as possible. Why does it matter? And Anatoly talked a little about this. First of all, it matters because this is the fight for freedom in our generation. And this is the American legacy. John F. Kennedy, on the afternoon that he was shot in Dallas and assassinated, was meant to give a speech that had a line that's become somewhat famous. He said, "We Americans, by destiny rather than choice, are the watchmen on the walls of world freedom." By destiny rather than choice. That's who we are. And today, this is the fight for freedom. And so we need to stand up. On top of that, Ukraine happens to be a great ally. So again, a country that turned to us and turned to the EU and said, you know, we want to be a country of free markets. We want to be a country of self-determination. We want to be a strong democracy. We want transparency in government. All the things that we support. So this strong ally needs our help now. And that's a good reason for us to be in this fight for freedom. Second, Ukraine is critical to our national security. And this gets lost sometimes in the discussions, but a strong, stable, pro-Western Ukraine is critical to us. Recall, this was and is the strongest, largest army in Europe. This is the bulwark against Russia's incursion, not just into Ukraine, but further west. This is also, frankly, our only battle-hardened ally. If you talk to some people here who have been in the military in Ukraine, who are joining us this morning, they will tell you, these soldiers are tough. I've been out to the front lines to talk to some of these soldiers. Many of you have. I was in Bakhmut back in the day, in 2018, 2019. These are battle-hardened troops. It's also a country that has a large military-industrial base that the United States benefits from already and will benefit more from. It's a critical military base that Europe needs as well. Technological advancements in Ukraine are amazing. So some of you have seen the drone technology that's been developed, some of the work with AI. Again, Ukraine is at the front lines of what is happening in terms of military strategy, in terms of ensuring that the United States will continue to have an ally that has that edge. Right now, frankly, engaging Russia is making a big difference for the United States. This doesn't mean we want the war to continue. We want the war to end. But think about it. Would we be waltzing into Venezuela if Russia wasn't distracted? Would things be different in terms of what's happening in Iran if Russia was not distracted? Would we have Syria having flipped now and become a country that we can work with without Russia being distracted? Think of what's going on in Africa with Russia being distracted. This is in our interest as a country to have Russia distracted, right? Because the malevolent activities around the world have been curtailed because of the fact that Ukraine is distracting Russia. Our interests in all those countries and the interests of Russia diverge, and so does it for what I call CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. That axis is weakened, and that's an indication of why it's so important for us from a military point of view and national security point of view to be allied with Ukraine. I just returned a few days ago from Taiwan. Some of you know that the Taiwanese are watching what happens in Ukraine very carefully. And talking to their national security experts, Ukraine kept coming up. They're watching what we do in Ukraine. As important, maybe more important, across the Taiwan Straits, the PRC is watching what we're doing very carefully in Ukraine. And if, in fact, we were to pull back, if, in fact, Ukraine were to fall, it's much more likely that China would see a way forward for their interests in Taiwan. None of this is in our interest as a country. So national security is a reason that we should care about what happens to Ukraine. Fortress Europe is something that will be very costly for the United States should Ukraine fall, because think about it, 4 more countries that we have a NATO alliance with an Article 5 obligation would now be on the border with Russia. Second, America should care because of the commercial and economic benefits. These are obvious to those of you in the room who are from Ukraine, but maybe not to all Americans. The most natural gas, of course, in all of Europe is where? In Ukraine. The most minerals, including rare earth minerals, in Europe are where? In Ukraine. One reason we have this agreement with Ukraine is because of this. Highly educated workforce, a technologically educated workforce. In terms of natural gas, by the way, the 3rd largest gas storage capability in the world is where? In Ukraine. And there are some interesting plans of using that storage to be able to help Europe more, using American LNG. This is in our commercial interest. The industrial base, obviously, is a huge part of Ukraine's economy. The agricultural opportunities are amazing. The food security that Ukraine already provides for the world can be enhanced greatly post-conflict. This is why China would like to have a foothold in Ukraine. And by the way, looking forward, as we have more success in Ukraine, as Ukraine has the ability to pursue its dreams, as Anatoly talked about, let's be sure that China doesn't take the opportunities commercially that the United States should take, and Europeans and others, because they're watching carefully too. And of course, it's one reason that Russia is so adamant about conquering Ukraine, because those economic opportunities are there. So we have a lot to gain, militarily, in terms of our national security, and in terms of our commercial interests and economic interests. There are some defeatists out there who say, okay, Portman, that's fine, but we're losing. Russia's winning. It's hopeless. That is simply not true. Look at the data. CSIS, a think tank here in Washington, recently came up with some interesting statistics, I think some from British intelligence, indicating the amount of harm that is occurring today with regard to the Russian economy and the Russian military. Their number is that Russia has suffered 1.2 million casualties. 1.2 million KIA, MIA, wounded. By the way, that's just since February of 2022. This is more than any country has suffered since World War II. Only 1.5% of Ukraine, by the way, has been taken by Russia in this most recent time period since 2024. Think about that. Huge casualties, very little to show for it. 325,000 are believed to have been killed. By the way, that compares to an estimate of about 120,000 in Ukraine. None of these numbers are perfect. We don't have all the exact numbers. Nobody does, I don't believe. But if my numbers are right, that means that Russia has suffered roughly 2.5 times more than Ukraine in terms of casualties, in terms of actual KIAs, people killed. This has taken an enormous toll on Russia. So those who say Russia is winning, I don't see it. In parts of eastern Ukraine, where progress had been made, it's been a horrible war of attrition for Russia. Think about this. On average, in those areas where progress is being made, the progress is 15 to 70 meters a day. Talk about a war of attrition, a grind. This, by the way, is less progress than any war of any country since World War I. You have to go back there to see that kind of war of attrition. So, Slava Ukraini. Heroyam Slava. Think of what they are doing every day. Those soldiers on the front line. Yes, there are more people in Russia, of course. Yes, there are more soldiers, of course. Although another thing that I've learned recently from some sources, including British intelligence, is that during November and December, most recent data that people have, there were more casualties than there was replenishment of the Russian army. So this notion that somehow the number of people makes it inevitable, recruitment is hard for them and not keeping up with the casualties. So 15 to 70 meters a day, grinding it out. It's horrible, but it's certainly not what I would call a victory. Plus, the Russian economy is weak, and it's getting weaker. And that's been a change. The sanctions are beginning to bite more. It's beginning to make more of a difference. The estimates for Russia's GDP over the last year is 0.6%. And when the World Bank and others look at the future, they think this year maybe 0.7%. Virtually no growth. And if we were to do certain things with regard to sanctions, increase sanctions, of course, it would have even a bigger impact. So what do we do now? What do we do to ensure that what I talked about at first, which is the hope and opportunity and why we should care about Ukraine from a national security, from an economic point of view, how do we solidify those gains? Of course, weapons, particularly air defense, are desperately needed. We talked about the attacks yesterday. There are more attacks going on as we talk. Most of the drones, hundreds of them, were shot out of the sky last night, but not all of them. And the missiles that made their way through killed innocent civilians, destroyed more energy infrastructure. So yes, we need to provide them more help to help stop those drones and the missiles, and to be able to help stop the drones and missiles from being fired in the first place. Tightening sanctions, of course, is another important step forward, and particularly, in my view, going after the shadow fleet, which is oil tankers that are not bearing the Russian flag, but in fact are going around the world delivering Russian oil and gas, which is what's funding the war machine. Some of you have followed what's been happening in Venezuela. You probably noticed that some of those ships are Russian ships, but part of the shadow fleet, taking embargoed oil from Venezuela after they brought embargoed oil from Russia. We're beginning, as you know, to do some marine interdictions of those ships. Let's continue that. It won't take much, in my view. It's very difficult to buy insurance when there's a marine interdiction going on. And I think it could stop relatively quickly. And the shadow fleet is one of the problems right now. What else can we do? There's the Lindsey Graham bill in the United States Senate, 85 co-sponsors out of 100. Not bad. That legislation could be passed. I will say that there are additional reasons for hope. You won't find this in the mainstream media probably, but the Senate Foreign Relations Committee recently voted on a sanctions bill. It was called the Shadow Fleet Sanctions Bill, but it had to do with much more. It had to do with oil and gas and minerals and so on. It passed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee by a vote of 20-2. 20-2. So those who say, where are the American people? Where is Congress on this? Whose side are they on? 20-2. Having been a former member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I'm impressed. Minerals, fertilizer, agricultural products, uranium. There are other areas we can sanction, and more financial sanctions are needed as well. These are all things that we can and should do. So as these talks continue in Abu Dhabi this week, as the talks in Miami just occurred over the last couple of days, now is the time for all of us, freedom-loving people, the United States and others, to redouble our efforts, because Ukraine's future does matter to us as Americans and as freedom-loving people. And that fight for freedom is far from lost. It's within our grasp. The alternative to somehow allow this illegal, totally unprovoked and brutal attack to continue unanswered is not in our interest. Thank you for having me here today. Thank you for coming. Thank you for caring. And again, Slava Ukraini.
How's it going? Good to see you. It's good to see you.
Thank you very much, Senator Portman. Those were very important words that you said. Welcome to our first panel. And our first panel is going to be discussing the current state of negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and Europe, and what is needed to deter future Russian aggression. We have a very distinguished panel here. Ambassador John Herbst, who is the Senior Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have Max Bergman, who's the Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the one that just produced this report to which Senator Portman was alluding. And we have Mykola Murski from Razom. He's a program director there, and I'm going to put in a plug. Razom is an organization that I support, and you're doing very important work, humanitarian work in Ukraine.
Thank you.
And I would urge all of you to go to their website and just see what they're doing to help the Ukrainian population in this very difficult time. So I've asked the panel to answer a few questions here. They may do more than that. Where the current negotiations stand, what gaps there are between the Ukrainian and American position, to the extent that we know that. Are the Russians, in fact, really interested in a settlement? And if time, or if they're interested, something about the current domestic situation in Ukraine and how that might be impacting on the negotiations. And I will just give you my 2 cents before I turn to Ambassador Herbst. In my opinion, the Russian negotiations are all performative. Vladimir Putin has no interest in ending this war at the moment because he still believes that Russia can win this war, and with all these horrific attacks on the energy infrastructure in Ukraine, we see that so far. But in typical kind of Soviet and Russian style, the Russians are negotiating, and they will continue to negotiate, and they will continue to negotiate. But that doesn't mean that they're interested in a settlement, and they're partly doing this clearly to humor the Trump administration and to prevent there from being any more sanctions. And so I would just echo what Senator Portman said. I think the only way to get the Russians to be serious about negotiations instead of these performative ones would be tightening the sanctions, as he said, on the shadow fleet, and providing Ukraine with all the weapons that it needs to continue to push back against Russia, including air defenses and other weapons systems. Maybe my panelists will disagree with me, but we'll see. So let's start off with Ambassador Herbst.
Angela, thank you. I agree with everything you said, but even though I can't claim insider access in the Kremlin, I would like to start by taking us behind the curtain in the Kremlin to understand clearly why Angela's description is correct. It's pretty simple. Putin's having a tough time with this war, and while he does believe his troops can make substantial further gains, even though they haven't done much since the big invasion began, he understands that that is only possible if he prevents the United States from using its great resources to stop him. And Angela mentioned, Lord, two of the three great resources. One, of course, are more sanctions on Russia. And we're seeing, I'm not saying a directed at the Kremlin increase of sanctions on Russia, but we're seeing a consequence of the Venezuela operation as the United States is now going after Russian shadow fleet oil carriers in ways that it was not before. So that's one, because the Russian economy is stumbling along. Two, weapons, and yes, that includes interceptors to reduce the damage done by Putin's war on cities, civilians, and energy infrastructure, but also long-distance strikes. And while the last word on long-distance strikes that we've heard was Trump saying, well, no to Tomahawks right now, the fact that at one point he was talking about Tomahawks publicly represents a clear step forward. And if we in fact gave Russia Tomahawks in quantities, they could take out a lot of the production facilities for Russian ballistic missiles and drones, which is why we should do it. And in fact, what should appeal to the White House, should does not mean does, an announcement. The next time Russian missiles and drones hit Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, we will provide 100 Tomahawks. And the time after that it happens, 500 Tomahawks. So the Russian side, the Kremlin, begins to see what's moving us, what's provoking us. But the third point, where in a sense the United States' role is secondary, but our role is never secondary when we don't want it to be, is of course the frozen Russian state assets. I will say, not no doubts, but few doubts that had the administration weighed in on the frozen assets issue in the past 3 or 4 months, the decision in Belgium would have been very different. And so this is something else we could work with and should work with. So Putin's game, his performative negotiations, is designed to make sure Trump does not go in that direction. And he's had a fair amount of success, but less than he expected. And this is interesting. I'm one of a relatively small number of observers. Two of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council are with me in this, Dan Fried and Bill Taylor. Maybe I should say I'm with them. When we say that, unlike most of our colleagues, we don't think that Trump is in the process of handing Ukraine to Putin. Not because Trump understands the geopolitical importance to the United States, which is very high, of stopping Kremlin aggression in Ukraine. Let's remember something you never see in our newspapers or never hear from a senior administration official. Moscow's strategic doctrine says we are adversary number one. And their efforts against us are not related only to the war in Ukraine. So we have a vital interest in ensuring, and Senator Portman outlined many of the specific reasons, that our only peer nuclear superpower, which considers us enemy number one, does not win in Ukraine. Because as Steve Biegun says, a former Deputy Secretary of State, under Trump in term one, no international problem of any significance is enhanced by a Russian victory in Ukraine. And everyone is worsened from the American point of view. So, Putin understands he needs to jolly Trump without giving him anything. That's why he praises him at every moment. And he says, yes, you're a great peacemaker, and yes, I want to make peace with you, but there are just these few little things that have to be worked out. And we saw the effect of that to our disadvantage, briefly, when Trump laid down a hard red line of August 8 for an end to Russian shooting in Ukraine or major sanctions follow. Special Envoy Witkoff showed up in Moscow a few days before that, announced that the Russians were willing to make serious peace, and instead of having sanctions, we had Anchorage. But the limits of Putin's influence over Trump, and that's why we should not be all sourpussed, were demonstrated right after Anchorage. First, Trump got on the phone with half of Europe, as well as Zelensky, to report the results. The next thing we know, 3 days after Anchorage, or actually 2 days after Anchorage, half of Europe showed up in the Oval Office. And from that point until the end of October, we saw growing American pressure on the Kremlin. And it took two forms. I'll be done in 2 minutes. One, on the military side, Trump talked about tomahawks in a positive way. And since I've been talking about tomahawks for 18 or more months, I was delighted to see it. But of course, Putin got on the phone with Trump, and no tomahawks by the time Zelensky arrived in Washington 2 days later. But with that exception, and that's not insignificant, the meeting was okay. And right after that, we got the sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. After which, Putin, recognizing he cannot control Trump by himself, and by control I mean manipulate him in the ways he wanted, he sends Dmitriev, right, to Florida to deal with Witkoff and Kushner. And from that, sadly, we got the 28 points. But the 28 points lasted 3 days, right? Driscoll gives it to Zelensky in Kyiv. 3 days later, Rubio's leading the American team in Geneva, and the 28 points are toast. And so we've seen this back and forth, literally since Trump took office. And right now, what we've got is what seems to be the American position still in favor of that most dreadful of the 28 points, that Ukraine cede the Western Donbass, albeit in the effort, the not very geopolitically wise effort to do that, we give Ukraine real security guarantees, which Zelensky says are okay. We don't know what they are, because there's basically been very little information about the details of the negotiations since the 28 points were leaked. But we know Zelensky says they're okay. And remember, when Trump and Zelensky got into it in the Oval Office, there were two issues that truly annoyed POTUS. One, security guarantees. The other, Putin can't be trusted. And notice, since then, Trump has moved on both of those issues. So we've had now, to give the devil his due, Putin has finally made a concession in the negotiations. Not a substantive concession, because he wants to take Ukraine. That's still his goal. But he made a process concession, right? Zelensky and Trump, since April or May of last year, were talking about trilateral talks, or Ukrainian-Russian talks. Putin gave in on that. That was his bow to Trump, but not on substance. And just one more point on substance. While the official, to the extent that we can figure it out, Russian position is give me West Donbass, and then we make a deal. And conceivably, they might be willing to do that, because given West Donbass, they've given the highway to Kyiv and to Dnipro and to the whole East Bank or the left bank is the way they talk about it for some reason, of the Dnipro River. Because the Russians have been unable, despite almost 4 years of the big invasion, to take the fortified zone of Western Donbass. So it would be geopolitically, it would be suicide for Ukraine to give it, and it would be extraordinarily stupid for the United States to go along, because we're giving the Russians Western Donbass at the same time we're giving security guarantees. So if those security guarantees mean anything, that means greater risk to American forces because the Russians have the most valuable piece of real estate in Ukraine. Hopefully, someone in the White House understands that. Hopefully. But last point, because ultimately I'm not a pessimist, which is not the same as being an optimist. I don't think the White House will push that really hard because the consequences, for reasons I've quickly explained, are disastrous. And we know that Trump does not like being seen as a putz. And that's why he's pushed back on Putin, ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and I'm glad that you're optimistic about something. I would just say that the 28-point peace plan might be toast here, but it's not toast in Russia, because that's what they keep talking about in the so-called Anchorage formula, which who knows what that is.
Not to mention Lavrov's wanting the whole Black Sea coast and Novorossiya and Oedgreb to Transnistria.
Right.
Yes.
Max.
Well, thanks, Angela. And I wish I could disagree with you and with the ambassador, but unfortunately, I think I see it basically the same way. The way I would describe this, and the analogy I've been using, is when I take my 6-year-old to the playground, they have a merry-go-round. And I take him, and there's all this excitement. You get on the merry-go-round, you spin around, there's a lot of movement, you get kind of confused about where you are, and you get off at exactly the same place where you started. And I think that's the negotiations that we're in right now. There's a lot of movement, a lot of activity, but I just don't see this really headed anywhere, and I desperately hope that I'm wrong. But what it seems like to me is that the West has been negotiating with itself. A US, Ukraine, European negotiation about a peace plan that is supposed to be informed by Witkoff and Kushner's and others' correspondence with Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So even there's a degree of separation from the actual sort of Kremlin national security decision-making, at least officially. So the idea that this plan is then informed by where the Russians are, and then now there are going to be talks that are just going to agree to this, I just don't think it's going to happen. And I think where we're going to be at over the next year is the merry-go-round's going to go again. So it took a year for the Russians to sort of agree to sit down for talks. Great. Okay. And we know what this looks like because we've seen negotiations over Ukraine and over the Donbass during the Minsk I and II process. So I think where we are right now, if we were to take a step back, does Putin want peace? So, and I think thank the senator for his comments and for recognizing some of the work that CSIS has done. This war has been a total disaster for Russia. It is totally true. But if I were to go back and you were to tell me Russia was going to suffer more than 1 million casualties, its economy now is going to be quite struggling, I would say, yeah, Russia's going to be desperate for peace. But unfortunately, I just don't see it structurally inside of Russia. I think there's not much pressure right now politically on Putin, and in some of your great work, Angela. I mean, I think the thing that he cares most about is the preservation of his regime, and I don't see a lot of pressure as of now on his regime. They experienced basically no economic growth last year, but they experienced some. They're not in a deep, deep recession. They're now having to look at cuts to perhaps some of the war effort, some of the social services. They're still finding money to pay people to go and fight at the front. They're still able to have an economy that's largely thriving because, or largely doing okay, at least from finding goods on the shelves, because they have this big, supermarket called China where they can buy what they need. Transshipment is working. So this is by no means great. But if you look at what's happening inside of Russia and look at what's happening inside of Ukraine, and I think this is how Putin is tabulating where things stand. They said, okay, we're on the right side of this war of attrition. Let's pummel Ukraine's electricity grid during this massive cold snap. I mean, could you imagine right now in Washington, D.C., we are all just completely struggling under ice and freezing temperatures. But if we had no power, I mean, it would be an utter disaster. So I think they feel that they are on the right side of this attritional war. And then if you take a step back and say, what is Putin after, right? What does success here look like? And what is failure? I think what failure looks like is Ukraine being able to realize its European future. So if you think where these talks are supposed to head, which is basically that you can have an end to the fighting, where there's not going to be missiles flying into Ukrainian cities and neighborhoods and killing coal miners, and that Ukraine can think about the future, and that future is destined toward the West, towards Europe, towards transatlantic relationship, towards the European Union. That's defeat. That is defeat for Russia. It's not about the Donbass. I just don't think that this is what this is about. So I think where we are is Putin cannot accept a situation where there's an end to the fighting in which Ukraine can go on its merry way. So what they're looking at is, let's give this another year and maybe see if we can really break the back of the Ukrainian military. If maybe next year or the year after, Ukraine would be willing to basically, forego any Western illusions. But I think there is a really dangerous middle ground. And this is the middle ground that basically existed between 2014 and 2022, or February 2022, which is a forever war. We fought in Afghanistan for 20 years. It was sort of off the front pages of American newspapers, even though we had troops fighting and dying on the ground for a decade before the calamitous withdrawal. Russia can sustain a war against Ukraine indefinitely. It doesn't have to keep fighting the way that it's currently fighting. And I think that is a dynamic that really troubles me, because they can make this war more sustainable so that they can just do it for another 5 years. So maybe they're losing fewer people. Maybe they're not getting quite the same number of recruits. And I think what we're looking at is Russia trying for the next year to really push, maybe to break the back of Ukraine. And if they're not able to do that, I think downshifting. And that is really bad. That is a better outcome than losing, but that is still not a great medium to long-term outcome for Ukraine. And so I think where we are, some good news. Well, maybe some bad news first. The bad news is the U.S. has basically decided we're not going to fund Ukraine anymore. Yeah. It was great work, I think, in the Congress to ensure that there is still money for Ukraine, but we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, not the tens of billions from the last supplemental that was passed in April of 2024. And so there's a lot of weapons being delivered to Ukraine from the Biden era funding. And so there's a long tail there. And so it's great that the administration is continuing to deliver. It's also great, as Ambassador Herbst noted, and the Senator noted, the increase in enforcement on sanctions. And I think hopefully the Europeans as well finally decide that they can get serious about cracking down on the shadow fleet. And I think that could exacerbate Russia's economic challenges. So I think there's progress there. But I don't see funding materializing for more efforts for the US to support Ukraine. And I think the good news, and this is the shift to the good news, is that in 2025, I think this is where we saw the Europeans step up, decide that they were going to finance Ukraine's war effort. And there's two initiatives. One, through NATO, the Pearl Initiative, where Europe is basically buying what was American military aid, right? Now they're buying weapons from the US. Then they're going to supposedly be able to deliver weapons faster to Ukraine from their stockpiles. There's a lot that can go wrong in this chain of events. And I really encourage everyone to read the Adamentos piece in the New York Times, which looks at the Pentagon's, U.S. defense industrial base was a major problem, major constraint to supporting Ukraine under the Biden administration. They didn't want to talk about it because they didn't want to talk about how the U.S. didn't have enough weapons. The Trump administration is really talking about it. And so when it comes to Tomahawks, when it comes to air interceptors, PAC-3 and Patriot systems, we don't have enough supply. U.S. forces are stretched in some of these areas where if you're a bean counter at the Pentagon looking at numbers, you suddenly see on your spreadsheet that we're below levels. And so now the Europeans are coming and trying to jump the 10-year queue or roughly 10-year queue for Patriots. We'll see. But that then is beneath the president's level. It gets into the Pentagon, which is not shown, at least parts of the Pentagon, politically, not shown a big inclination to support Ukraine. So that's the bad news. But the Europeans are stepping up to buy American aid. The second thing is to maybe slightly disagree with Ambassador Herbst. I actually think the best outcome possible happened for Ukraine in December at the European Council Summit. And here's why. It gets into a lot of EU internal stuff. But basically what the option A, and there was no real option B until the European Council Summit happened. Option A was to basically permanently freeze the frozen Russian assets. The EU was going to issue a loan off of those frozen assets and then give that to Ukraine. It was actually somewhat convoluted, but what they did is they actually did permanently freeze the frozen Russian assets. It used to be every 6 months the EU would have to have a unanimous vote to freeze to continue sanctions. Every 6 months, the Hungarians had effectively a hostage that they could take. And so it was really concerning to do a loan, massive loan based off these frozen Russian assets. EU lawyers are kind of amazing when they need to be, and they invoke some clause where now it requires a qualitative majority vote in the European Council to unfreeze. So those assets are now frozen forever. But the Belgians, they did have some legitimate concern that if 20 years down the line, they would be on the hook for these, and it was all very complicated. But so the backup solution was, well, they have a currency, this thing called the euro, which during COVID, they borrowed a huge amount of money to support economic growth in response to COVID. But to the Germans, this was never again. This was a one-off. And then so the fallback solution is, okay, we'll just borrow 90 billion. But that is a well that the Europeans can tap again and again and again. And so they have broken the seal on borrowing for Ukraine. I think that is very crucial. Now, how does Europe ramp up its defense industrial base? How does it ramp up its defense industrial production? This is like a gangly teenager trying to sort of start running really fast. It's looking really awkward, but the hope is that in 2026 that builds. So that with that, combined with Ukrainian-owned domestic industrial production in the EU under Defense Commissioner Kubilius, has been very forward-leaning on thinking about Ukraine as part of the EU defense industrial base to ramp up Ukraine's own domestic long-range strike, so that Ukraine can start bringing this war to Russia. Because I think that is how we get out of this trap of a forever war, is that this war has to, in some ways, unfortunately, be spread. The costs have to be felt by Russia. That happens by sanctions. It also happens by making the Russian public decide, well, what the hell are we actually doing? Why are we suffering for the Donbass? And so maybe just one final point. I hope I am wrong here, but what really troubles me is that there's just a lack of expertise in the US negotiating team. If you asked me to negotiate a massive commercial real estate deal, and you gave me no help, you gave me no lawyers, no bankers, no inspectors, I bought a house. I could maybe figure something out. But what we're seeing is that it is this being led by people that don't have expertise around them. And I think that should really trouble us, because I think the experts look at this and be like, we know what's happening here.
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's very important to point out that Vladimir Putin is not a businessman. He's a former KGB agent, and he's actually not really interested in the business. Mikhail.
Thank you. As I was listening to Max and to Ambassador Herbst, this idea occurred to me that the Russians are seeking something in Ukraine that isn't based on material concerns. They're not seeking territory. They're not seeking more people. They're not seeking oil. They're after an idea. They're trying to prevent an idea from taking root in Ukraine. But at the same time, it's not ideas, it's matter that will be able to stop Russia from achieving its goal. What do I mean by that? It's on us to make sure that we have sufficient sanctions in place so that way Russia can't use its shadow fleet to move its oil around. The gold that we have frozen, Russian state assets that are here in the US, There's $8 billion that are in the basement of the New York Federal Reserve in Manhattan. And they're in this room that says Russian Federation. They need to be physically moved, put on a cart, and rolled to a different room, ideally one that says Ukraine. I think that to me, this is a very helpful way of thinking about this. We cannot fight the Russian imperial mindset with ideas and with trying to convince them that it's not a good idea. We have to put matter in their way, physical, material things that you can actually touch to signal to them that we're serious. And I think that this is one of the big frustrations that we have with the way that the Trump administration has been going about this, is they aren't putting anything physical in Russia's way, giving anything physical to Ukraine, or taking anything physical out of Russia's hands. And I think that is the theme that I'm seeing emerge, that we need to do more to encourage the administration to see, for them to understand that the only way for Russia to back off is for us to put matter in their way. And I think that I actually disagree with you, Angela, a little bit on this. I think that the war does not end when we put sufficient pressure on Russia for them to come to the negotiating table. I think that we just have to put sufficient pressure on them for them to stop the war. I don't think Putin's going to come to us and say, okay, I'll give on this, but I'm not going to cave on these things. Are you guys okay with that? I think that given how he sees this, and given how the Russian imperial mindset sees Ukraine and the Russian war against Ukraine, the only way that this ends is if we put sufficient matter in their way, take enough matter out of their hands, where they say, okay, fine, we'll stop. To your initial question of, is Putin actually interested in peace? I think that there's 3 or 4 things that we can look at to identify whether or not that's the case. The first is history. The second is the Russian economy. The third is, what is Russia actually doing right now, in particular with Ukrainian kids? And then the fourth is statements that are coming out of Kremlin officials. On the first question, if we look at history, the Russian imperial mindset that reigns right now in much of Russia and certainly in the Kremlin is one that is not new. Putin did not invent the idea of taking Ukraine. He did not invent the idea of conquering a quarter of Georgia. These are things that he did not invent. He did not say, it's going to bolster my rule. If I do this, I'm going to invent this idea of the Russian Empire. This existed. The Ukrainian language was actually banned in the Russian Empire in the late 1800s, in the Valuyev Circular and in the Ems Ukaz. They banned the use of the Ukrainian language in public. Ukrainian and Russian share an alphabet. There's a couple letters that are different. The grammatical structures are pretty similar. The vocabulary is closer to Polish than it is to Russian. But they banned a language from being used in public. You could not speak publicly from a stage like this one in Ukrainian. You'd be arrested. Songs that were performed in Ukrainian in the late 1800s in public, the musicians were arrested. In the 1930s, in order to tamp down the Ukrainian national spirit, forced collectivization of Ukrainian farms killed millions of Ukrainian farmers. The same thing happened in Kazakhstan. This idea that Russia wants to conquer Ukraine for the sake of they want to make sure that they have access to Ukrainian critical minerals or to the oil and gas that are in Donbass, or they want to make sure that they can have more people. Simon from the Russia Matters Institute at the Harvard Belfer Center, he has this idea that Russia's trying to conquer Ukraine because they have a demographic problem and they just need more people to work in their factories. None of that's true. There's an imperial mindset that pushes Russia to conquer Ukraine, to do exactly what Max said. They can't allow Ukraine to go its merry way towards the West. It's unfathomable. I think that for Putin, the only victory that he would actually be satisfied with is if he was able to go to 2 places in Ukraine and pray. One is the monastery of the caves in Kyiv, the Kyiv-Pecherska Lavra, and 2 is Pochayiv in western Ukraine, in Galicia in western Ukraine. This lavra, this complex of monasteries, still belongs to the Russian Orthodox Church. For those who think that the Russian Orthodox Church has been fully banned in Ukraine, that's not true. Individual priests who commit crimes are arrested. If they commit treason against Ukraine, of course, they are arrested, as they should be. But this massive complex of monasteries in western Ukraine, in Galicia, in Ternopil Oblast, is still operated by the Russian Orthodox Church. Putin needs to go to those 2 sites, pray, get a picture of himself praying, and I think that is what will be victory for him. It shows that he will have won this civilizational conflict. The second reason why I think Putin is not ready for peace is that his economy is now largely dependent on the Russian war machine. He can't fire the millions of workers that are now employed producing weapons to be used in Ukraine. That's just not realistic. That's not something that he can afford to do, at least in the short term. Perhaps he'll figure out a way to do that over the course of the next few years, but that's not happening anytime this year or next year. And the third reason why I think Putin's not ready for peace is that he is now spending this year, I think, $850 million on militarization and re-education programs for Ukrainian kids. 160,000, not 160 or 1,600, 160,000 Ukrainian kids have been enrolled in militarization and re-education programs run by the Russian state. That's a pretty incredible number. If there were 160,000 American kids that were kidnapped and put into re-education programs and militarization programs by the Chinese Communist Party, 160,000 American kids, we would be up in arms. That would be kind of all we really talked about. That's the reality that Ukraine is facing right now. There have been roughly 2,000 kidnapped kids who have been returned. Of the 19,586 known cases of kidnapped kids, just under 2,000 have been returned. The First Lady of the United States is engaged on this issue, and some kids have been returned based on her mediation and based on the work of Qatar and other countries to try and return these kids. But those only represent 5% of the total number of kids that have been returned. 95% are kids who were rescued through rescue operations. Ukrainians risk their lives to somehow get into Russia, get these kids out and bring them back into Ukraine. And these operations cost huge, untold sums of money, and they risk the child's life and the rescuer's lives. There have been no kids returned through direct Ukrainian-Russian negotiations. So this idea that, I hear sometimes from the administration that, Ukraine and Russia just need to meet, they need to bury the hatchet, Russia really wants Ukraine to succeed. If you actually look at the facts on the ground, obviously, they belie this narrative 100%. And then, obviously, of course, we can look at statements from Kremlin officials who are saying that we're not going to be satisfied until we get all of Ukraine. People are still writing Na Berlin on missiles and on Russian tanks, saying, repeating this World War II motto that we're not going to stop until we get Berlin. So I think that, all the panelists are in vehement agreement that Putin is not interested in peace, and that we need to do a better job of demonstrating to the administration that if Trump wants the Nobel Peace Prize, if he actually wants the killing to stop, he has to disabuse himself of this idea that Putin is some kind of a partner on that path to peace.
Thank you very much. Dalibor, how are we doing on time? Do we have extra time because we started the panel late, or do we? Okay, all right. So do any of the panelists, do you have anything that you would like to comment on what your fellow panelists have said? Okay, so let me just ask all of you briefly, and starting with Ambassador Herbst. What would it take, let's say there is an agreement in the settlement, what would it take to deter Russia from doing this again, given the fact that we know that previous security guarantees that were given to Ukraine, we can start off with the Budapest Memorandum, we can talk about Minsk negotiations, that they obviously failed.
Well, the Budapest Memorandum was all about assurances, not guarantees.
Right.
And in my understanding from Steve Pfeiffer, who was involved in negotiations, was that we made that clear.
Yeah.
And the English language was the controlling language, said the word assurances,
Right.
not guarantees. Having said that, it was a political commitment, which makes us look not very strong as a result. And for that matter, UK, China, France, and then, of course, the aggressor, Russia itself. To me, it's clear, and I think we saw that, we've seen the ideas which could lead to this result coming from Trump world itself. During the campaign for our 2024 presidential election, his people were talking about, one, arming Ukraine to the hilt, two, European troops in Ukraine, and while they themselves were not saying it, people like me were saying it before our election, to have European troops there, you have to have a backstop. And the backstop was, verboten in Trump land until about 6 or 8 months ago. And now we hear about a backstop all the time. So those things combined could actually do this. Now, of course, one problem with this, and you pointed this out in your introductory remarks, and I think everyone else, we all echoed it in one way or another, is that the terms which we talk about for an agreement are basically terms agreed between Kyiv and Washington, not Moscow. So every other day, or maybe twice a day, someone senior in Moscow says, of course no European troops in Ukraine, and of course no US security guarantees. But if we were actually to do things which Team Trump has mentioned, this would not be wunderbar, but it would be good enough for government work to achieve the objective of stopping future Russian aggression. Because again, the sad thing about this war, which again did not begin nearly 4 years ago, it began, nearly 12 years ago, is that if you had strong American and Western policy, the Russians would lose easily, with very little sacrifice by the United States and our European allies. Sadly, we've had weak leadership or peculiar leadership on this issue for the last 12 years.
Yeah, thank you. Mikola?
I think that the analogy to Budapest is very apt. If you look at the cover page of the Budapest Memorandum, or at least one edition of it, in English it says security assurances, and in Ukrainian and Russian it says bezpekovi garantii, which means guarantees. And so I think that my fear is that this will repeat itself, is that we will tell the Ukrainian people, and the Ukrainian government will also tell the Ukrainian people, that it has meaningful guarantees when that is not the understanding here in the United States. In the bilateral security agreement that the Biden administration and Zelensky's team negotiated in, I think it was 23, maybe it was 20, I actually forget what year it was.
It started in 23, but
They signed it like summer 24, right, in Italy. This was being messaged as security guarantees to the Ukrainian people. The Zelensky administration messaged this as security guarantees, or as part of security guarantees. So my concern is that, there's going to be a significant mismatch in expectations between the American people, the Trump administration, the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian people, which I think is extremely dangerous. That said, I do agree with Ambassador Herbst that the administration does deserve our gratitude for a number of things. One, the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which will hopefully take effect sooner rather than later. That's a pretty big step the Biden administration never took. And I think that it's a strong step. It shows Putin that Trump is in fact, under certain circumstances, willing to take steps that are going to be costly to Putin. Two is this energy ceasefire agreement pause that was negotiated very recently.
But has it actually happened? I've been looking for
I
evidence.
think for one night, maybe, yeah.
And I think that the Russians have focused their strikes on logistics.
And miners.
But they have been, I think that the aspect that I find the most promising is that Trump actually did something about this. He initiated this. He put the initial pressure on Putin to not strike Ukrainian energy infrastructure. So the fact that Trump called or texted or whatever, picked up the red line, I'm sure that's not what happened, and told Putin, hey, I need you to stop doing this, that's very promising. I think that we should be thanking and praising the administration for that, because I want to see more of that. Yeah. The Trump administration also increased intel sharing with Ukraine to enable more deep strikes with Ukraine. That was in the late spring, early summer, I think. That's very promising. That's very exciting, and I think that the administration deserves our praise and thanks for that. And also for keeping the Biden-era FMF, FMS, and USAI contracts going and not cutting off the delivery of the supplies that were contracted to be produced under the Biden administration, not cutting off that delivery to Ukraine.
Max, how do we deter Russia?
Yeah. So maybe to start backwards, right? So if Russia were to agree to a ceasefire, why did they do that? And it's because of Ukraine. So I think the major security guarantee for Ukraine is Ukraine. And when I sort of get beyond that, and just to be deeply cynical for a moment, all this talk of a coalition of the willing, of UK, France, and other European nations signaling a willingness to put forces in Ukraine if there's a ceasefire. look, the cynicism is Russia is just never going to accept that. So because that literally means losing the war. That means NATO is in Ukraine. So why not just keep fighting if that is on the table? And my cynicism is I think this is a way for two countries, France and the UK, that have real budget constraints, want to lead on European security issues, but have no ability to actually, don't have the financial capacity right now to significantly do what Ukraine needs, which is providing weapons and funding. And so this is a way of backing Trump's peace efforts and putting themselves at the center of the European security conversation. But it's going nowhere. There is not going to be a coalition of the willing, I think, on the ground unless there's some dramatic change in Moscow. Then we get to the US side. Look, there is, unfortunately, while I think we here in this room may disagree, it does seem that there is a very clear bipartisan consensus that is not in favor of giving Ukraine the security guarantees. And what I mean by that is not willing to go to war for Ukraine, not willing for America to go fight Russia if it were to do something. That I just don't see changing. So I think what does this mean? I think we need to be clear-eyed about it, and that the future of Ukraine's security, if there is going to be a ceasefire, really rests on, number one, Ukraine, and number two, a willingness of European and other partners to throw weapons and to really integrate themselves as much as possible so that if there is a war, they are basically involved, both the US and Europe, but mainly Europe here. And so I think, if we can get to a situation where there's actually real negotiations, the coalition of the willing is the thing that will get negotiated away. And in that sense, it will be useful as something to negotiate away from. But I just don't see the security guarantees being all that real and credible, especially at a moment, just last point, when, right now in NATO, in the European countries, that are sort of reeling after the US was talking about trying to seize Greenland, NATO territory. And so there's a sense in Europe that what does a US security guarantee mean actually within NATO? So I think we have to connect those two conversations.
Thank you very much. And we do now have some time for questions. And let me just say that for those of you who are online, if you have a question, you should submit it to Catherine with a K, Camberg, Camberg, @aei.org, and I will look for this. But let me start in the room here. Does anyone have a question? Yes, at the back there.
Hi, good morning. Erin McPhee from the Ukrainian Institute. So we're thinking about how to secure a democratic, more secure future for Ukraine. Thinking about the veteran and defenders population, prior to the invasion, there were 800,000 veterans. Now we're at about 1.2 million. We're looking at 6 to 8 million veterans and family members at whatever this end becomes. What is the role that you see these individuals playing in the dynamics and the topics that we've been hearing about today, so securing Ukraine's future? And what are some concrete things that need to start happening today in order to make that possible? Thank you.
Anyone want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a super interesting question. Ukraine has a lot of veterans already, and Ukraine will have even more veterans in the country if there is an after, right? If there is some kind of a peace agreement struck, and some of them are able to be demobilized. The Ukrainian military is the most trusted institution in Ukraine right now, on par with religious organizations. And it's a little bit, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, because at the same time, you have Ukrainian soldiers who are incredibly frustrated with inefficiency within the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. So there's this phenomenon in Ukraine where you trust your neighbors, you trust your colleagues, you trust your fellow soldiers, but as soon as you're going up the chain of command, it's like they're against us, I'm skeptical. It's the opposite in Russia, right? Where you trust your boss but not your neighbors. And so I think that I'm actually not sure how this dynamic's going to play out. I think that veterans and people who made a name for themselves in some way in the Ukrainian military are going to have very good chances of their political prospects are going to be bolstered by their experience in the military. The next president of Ukraine is probably going to have to, the next 5 presidents of Ukraine will probably have to be veterans. It's hard for me to imagine that somebody's going to be elected president of Ukraine or serve in in any important public-facing role in Ukraine that does not have military experience. They will probably not have been able to have been a high-ranking officer. I think that is going to be, people are going to be, especially one that transitions directly from being a high-ranking officer to, let's say, being president. I think that's less likely because of this skepticism toward the higher ranks in the MOD and in the general staff. But if you have a rank-and-file soldier who runs for office and has war stories, I think that's going to be, I think that he or she is going to be exceptionally popular. Ukraine does not have, Ukraine is still developing its infrastructure that makes it easier for people with disabilities to, move around the city. Very few buildings have wheelchair ramps. Very few apartment buildings have elevators. I think that's going to be like a pretty consistent issue that we're going to face. And there's going to be a lot of, I think, opportunity for American companies and American organizations that have experience working on ADA regulation implementation here in the US to share their expertise with Ukraine. The mental health crisis, I think, is going to be a very serious one. There are organizations that are beginning to step up, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. There's a lot of very sad stories, and there's a lot of very sad statistics that I think we need to put a lot more resources toward making sure that these veterans are able to reintegrate into their families. Their families are able to, work with them and engage with them effectively, and that they're able to be, effective and productive members of society. Long story short, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this front.
Thank you. We have an online question here. Some have speculated that the deal on the table is America gets Venezuela and Russia gets Ukraine. What do you think of this? Yeah, would you like to take
No,
that?
I don't think there was any sort of under-the-table discussion about that. I mean, Russia did have a real presence in Venezuela, but we shouldn't sort of necessarily overstate it. I think this was, Venezuela was driven by the administration perception that there was an opportunity there. And I think the administrations are never unitary. There are always different actors, different views inside of administration, different perspectives. And so there is a hawkish wing inside this administration that probably also calculated that this would be negative for Russia, negative for China, even if that wasn't maybe the core driving factor.
Yeah, and Russia, of course, still has a presence in Venezuela because the current president was the vice president, and the security forces are still working with Russians. So we shouldn't exaggerate the degree to which Russia's been thrown out. Any other questions from the audience here? Yeah. Yeah, if you want to wait for the microphone. There it is.
Hi, I'm Max Dreyer. I'm from the School for Ethics and Global Leadership. And I wanted to ask, Mikola, you talked a bit about putting matter in Russia's way to prevent them from taking Ukraine. And I wanted to know if that will ever involve putting US boots on the ground. And if so, what point do we need to get to before we should start doing that?
That's a good question. I think, this is related to what Max was saying earlier about, what Russia's willing to accept. I don't think that Russia would be willing to accept that. At the same time, I'm not sure how much that matters. I think that we need to put sufficient pressure on Russia where it decides it's not going to keep pursuing its ideological, religious objectives in Ukraine. And I'm not particularly interested in what they're able to give on and what they're not able to give on. We need to give Ukraine all the tools that it needs to push Russia back. We need to sanction them to hell. I think, to me, the question of what Russia is willing to accept or not actually is kind of irrelevant, because I don't think that actually helps us get to an answer. Not because I'm just rah, 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 Ukraine, which I am, but because I don't think that thinking about, is Russia willing to accept this? That doesn't actually help us achieve peace for Ukraine. We need to put matter in Russia's way. We need to take matter out of Russia's hands. We need to give Ukraine matter to repel Russia and push them back. That's what's going to lead to peace. Trying to analyze about well, Putin can give on this, but he can't give on this. Like he needs to go pray at the monastery of the caves in Epochayev. Like that's his goal, and we need to put something in his way that's going to stop him from doing that.
Maybe just one quick thought on that.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I do think that then the question really is in our countries, in Europe, in the United States, and I just look at it realistically. And what I don't see, and this is what came through with the Coalition of the Willing, a willingness to put European boots on the ground in a situation where drones are still flying at Ukrainian cities and would fly at them. So it's that risk tolerance that I don't see the West providing. The Ukrainians have been pushing and asking for that, and that I think that would change the calculation, but it could also lead to an expansion of this war. So that is the issue.
Just one quick point on that. I think it'd be good to separate the normative from the descriptive. Descriptively, there is no political will, either on the part of the US or European states, to put troops on the ground. Should there be? I think yes. I think that would not expand the war. It would show Russia that we're serious, and Russia would be like, shit, and pull back. Sorry. Excuse me.
John.
I don't think we should use the word never in this connection. I understand Mac's point that we have not seen a clear willingness on the part of almost any Western nation. I say almost any Western nation, because I can imagine Lithuania would be all in for this, and Poland maybe too. But look at how the approach to this war has evolved over the past year. On the part of the United States, again, Trump's team came with some ideas, but it wasn't clear that was actually the administration's policy. And as I already mentioned, Trump moved on two issues which had him throw Zelensky out of the White House, which was security guarantees and understanding that maybe Putin is not a good faith actor. Maybe, and I say because Trump has said the opposite every other day. And as for the Europeans, let me tell you an anecdote which is highly relevant. Again, the point I made about the elements of a potential durable peace that were in Trump's team, again, European troops, arming Ukraine to the hilt, adding an American backstop. A group of European parliamentarians came to the Atlantic Council in mid-January of 25, a week or so before the inauguration. And there were maybe 10 of us from the council around the table, most of whom shared the view that you take these elements and put them in place and you could have a durable peace. And everyone pretty much from the European delegation understood the danger that a revisionist Kremlin meant for themselves and understood the connection between their own security and Ukraine's. But every single one of them said, hell no, we're not going to do this. Forget European troops. You guys have to step up. And most of us responded, you have to be serious. Look at, this is the administration that won the election. No, we're not the guys coming into power. This is what they've said. You step up, you could actually move them in the right direction and get what you need, including the backstop. No. What happens 2 months later? Zelensky shows up in Washington. They had the mineral deal, and I thought, oh my good, this is all great. The tremors in the relationship between Kyiv and Washington started in mid-February, seem to have been gone, but Zelensky pushed too hard on those two themes, though he was right, he should not have laid into them for 20 minutes. He gets thrown out of the Oval Office, and suddenly European leaders are talking about troops. Now, they haven't gotten to actually putting rubber on the road, because this is a serious decision. But they've actually taken serious steps in that direction. They haven't built up their arms industry in a serious way, neither have we, which is to our disgrace. But they began to take steps in that direction. In terms of European national security policy, which never impressed me in my 31 years in the State Department, or the 8 or 10 years after I left the State Department, suddenly begins to look serious. So while they ain't gone far enough, they've taken substantial steps, which means don't say never, even to European troops on the ground, and don't say never to American troops on the ground. If you see the polling in the United States, like 85% of the American public understand Putin for the thug that he is.
Yeah.
And a large majority, including a majority of Republicans, say we should be giving aid to Ukraine. And we should be letting Ukraine smack the Russians wherever they want to. So the American people are not weak on this. The leadership has not been wonderful, as I've already mentioned. But that allows for a tougher policy if, in fact, the leadership begins to understand and talk publicly that the Russians consider us the embassy and an enemy. And while they are not as dangerous in the long term as the Chinese, they are the most dangerous right now because they're the one conducting a major war. They're the ones that have pure nuclear power, although maybe it's not so pure as we think. Just as we thought they had this juggernaut of a conventional military, they didn't, they don't. And of course, if Russia gets its way in Ukraine, that means bad news for us in Taiwan.
Okay, well, I think this was a slightly optimistic note to
Can't
end
help
on.
myself.
Please join me in thanking our panel for a terrific series of remarks. Thank you. And I'm going to wait and watch to see when Vladimir Putin is praying in the Pechevskaya Lavra.
To thank everybody watching us online and everybody who braved the weather to come to AEI this morning. I will reiterate what my colleague Angela Stent said earlier. You can submit your questions if you're watching us online to my colleague Catherine Campbell at AEI.org. And we'll also take questions from the room. So what I would like to do, first and foremost, is to thank our friends at the Ukrainian Institute for the Future for hosting this event with us. This is the first event of the so-called Ukraine Week in DC. And after the panel, I'll invite our friend Pavlo Ungurian, who is the co-host of the Ukraine Week in DC, to say a few words just as we wrap up. What I'll do now is that I'll introduce briefly our panelists, and I'll start with Anatoly Amelin, who's the director of the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. He sits on corporate boards in Ukraine, and he has sort of spearheaded the foundation and growth of this think tank, which is, as this conference, very much forward-looking and focused on the post-war future of Ukraine. Hans Braunfisch is the founder of Bravo Ventures, which is a investment fund based in the United States that is trying to connect American investors with startup opportunities and venture capital opportunities in Ukraine, working both on dual-use technologies, but also across a variety of sectors. He brings his experience from the world of consulting, business consulting, and is doing a kind of great job highlighting kind of venture capital opportunities in Ukraine. We have then Serhiy Haidaichuk, who is the founder and president of CEO Club of Ukraine, which is an association of owners and CEOs of large and medium-sized businesses in Ukraine. He's also the co-founder and board member of Young Business Club, which is a community for young entrepreneurs with 1,300 members across the world, not just in Ukraine. He's also been advising the president of Ukraine on economic reforms, and we'll get to some of these questions in a second. And I, earlier today, hinted at the possibility that we might have an extra speaker on our panel, which was not listed on the agenda, and I'm very pleased to welcome Edward Mermelstein to AEI. Edward served as the Commissioner for International Affairs in the city of New York under the Eric Adams administration. and he served as a liaison between the city of New York and the diplomatic community, consular corps, and various sort of international bodies that do their business in New York City. And he is, among other things, a refugee from Ukraine who came here at a very early age. And I'll probably start with you, Edward, if I may. So after leaving the city administration, you've been running an organization called Global Partners New York, which is trying to foster kind of bottom-up connections, if you will, kind of sub-national level diplomacy that connects New York to entities around the world, whether it's governments, NGOs, businesses. And it strikes me that this is something that is very relevant in the context of Ukraine. So the first panel discussed a certain sense of uncertainty that we have about the US position on Ukraine, the future of the Ukrainian US relations. And it strikes me that there might be a great role to be played by ordinary Americans, by businesses, by cities, by state governments, by civil society in fostering kind of informal, spontaneous ties with the counterparts in Ukraine in a way that will also build a political constituency inside of the United States that would press the government, the federal government, to step up its efforts to bring Ukraine to a victory in this war and also secure Ukraine's post-war future. So if you don't mind sharing kind of ideas on how ordinary Americans, business people involved in the world of NGOs and beyond could kind of be of help in sort of forging these ties, and what there might be in it for themselves.
Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation. Thank you to the Ukrainian Institute for the future. So as Commissioner for International Affairs, the job that I had was very much focused on building bridges between the diplomatic community as well as the business community in New York City. But what we also did quite a bit of is engage with both local and federal governments around the globe when emergencies had taken place. And the first thing that we did when Ukraine had its major start of the incursion, at this point 4 years ago, the city got engaged quite quickly and sent a substantial amount of aid to Ukraine, both food, medical, and other emergency equipment. And that is something that happened not just with New York City, it happened with many other cities all over the globe, as well as a private organization, many nonprofits. So the concept of global partners was born out of that idea. How do we use the platform of subnational diplomacy to create a vehicle that will lead not strictly from the point of view from a city or a federal government, but basically everything in between. It's the exchange of best practices that allows cities through, and New York City is a very unique platform simply because we have the largest diplomatic community in the world. We have basically 10% of the Fortune 500 companies in New York City. It's the largest municipal government and, well, in the United States, but also the largest financially, in terms of size, government, city government in the world. So we are in a very unique position that when we do certain things in New York City, we have a very wide audience around the globe, and that allows us to exchange best practices in a way that allows us to lead. So when we started Global Partners, it was with the idea of how do we access cities, federal governments, and businesses around the world, create a bridge that will connect New York City to other parts of the world. And when you have the largest diaspora pretty much from any country that is in New York City, and New York is again quite unique because when people are coming from all over the world, historically they've been coming to New York City, but also just in the last few years when we had the migrant crisis in New York City, you saw that many people coming from the southern border or from the northern border eventually were coming through the city of New York. So the idea is that given our interest in our very large communities, global communities that are represented in New York City, our job is to connect with cities and countries all over the world. Ukraine is just one of them. So when we are looking at Ukraine as an example, how do we create those bridges between the city of New York, its very large diplomatic corps, and the businesses that are in New York that are looking to go global, or global corporations that are looking to enter New York? How do we connect all those pieces and create a winning situation for both sides? So that's the concept of global partners, which is basically connecting the world through a platform of subnational diplomacy where federal governments are not necessarily in line with each other. It allows cities from all over the world to take a lead not just on diplomacy, but also on creating business bridges.
Thank you. I want to go to Ukrainian guests now, if I may. And I should say that my first real visit to Ukraine was in 2014, just in the aftermath of the Revolution of Dignity, and I brought with me a group of former Eastern European reformers from the 1990s, some of whom then stayed involved in Ukrainian life in the years that followed. And between 2014 and 2022, I think it's fair to say that Ukraine saw greater progress in strengthening its public finances, its financial system, rule of law, fighting against corruption than it saw that it had seen in the 20 plus years that had preceded it during its existence. Now, the full-scale invasion disrupted that progress necessarily. Nobody can blame the Ukrainians for prioritizing the defense against Russia over kind of minute details of business code reforms or fine-tuning the tax system. But I think it's going to be extremely important that these efforts to make Ukraine, institutionally speaking, an attractive place to do business and to invest have to take center stage as soon as the war ends. And I want to turn to Anatoly first, and perhaps ask him to give us reasons for optimism in that regard. Like, what is your sense of how kind of sharp the focus on strengthening the business environment is going to be once the war ends? And then I want to turn to Serhiy as well and ask him, perhaps to share stories that he certainly has from his conversations with CEOs and people who do business in Ukraine about their daily struggles. Like, how difficult is it to keep a business afloat in wartime Ukraine unless you are part of the so-called war economy? If you are just a regular business person trying to make a living, in a sector that is necessarily struggling as much of Ukraine's economy is struggling. So Anatoly, if you don't mind, let's start with you.
Thank you for the question. Do we have opportunity to show video or not today?
I'm not sure we could make it happen on this panel.
Okay. If talking about business,
Is that a yes?
Or we can.
That's a yes.
Okay. Oh.
it's a few answer for your question.
Okay.
We can do it now or later.
Oh, sorry. That wasn't part of the performance. Although, at least now you're lifted your heads and you're listening, let's get acquainted. My name is Hope in English, and I was born in a year Ukraine declared its independence. I'm not a fictional character. In 1991, 630,813 children were born. Girls, roughly half of them. And girls named Hope at least 1,000. I am one of them. It seems my parents didn't simply choose a name. It was the cry of an era. In 91, everyone was hoping, and it seems that neither I nor the country lived up to those expectations. When I was still struggling to pronounce the letter R, I remember the country gave up its nuclear arsenal. As soon as I learned to add numbers up to 10, I learned that because of inflation had made everything cost millions. My parents kept saying, "It's okay, Hope. When you grow up, you live in a normal country." But growing up, as it turned out, wasn't enough. You also have to mature. During the Orange Revolution, I saw for the first time how people can actually change something. I was 13. I still didn't know whether I'd become an engineer or an actress, but for the first time I felt that I could choose my own path as a young citizen of my country. So when I got the chance to make an adult choice at my first presidential election, I voted for stability. And the rest, you know. The people's hope began to crack at the seams. Instead of reforms, the monopolization of power and the misuse of public funds. And in kitchen conversations, that short, crude, but honest phrase appeared more and more often. We failed. I had to defend the consequences of my political naivety on the Maidan with force. This time, it was different. There were no hopes left. Except me, of course, and I assume hundreds of other hopes on the square. This time, instead of illusions, we built barricades, and the rest, you know. In 2022, everyone made their choice, as adults. But I suspect that in your hearts a quiet question still lingers. What for? I found the answer. I came across a book worth believing in, The Vision of Ukraine 2035. It's a hello from the future, where I no longer ask myself why I stayed. Because there are more reasons to stay than to flee. 207 pages is not something you read in one evening, I know. But I saw that by 2035, the well-being of every person has quadrupled. Because the economy had learned to export ideas, technologies, and complex products. Now imagine this. Grain is no longer the main resource. We became a country international capitals flows into because, but when the rules of the game are fair, money isn't afraid to settle. Ukraine 2035 is a 10 of 10 country, no buts, safe, thanks to effective military alliances, a leader in equality of growth, influential on issues of civilizational importance. Here, in 2035, I saw the fruits of the decisions we began making decades earlier, approximately starting today. So, my dear listeners, I won't try to say it better than it's already been said. I'll end with a quote by Abraham Lincoln. The best way to predict the future is to create it. And I agree. The vision of Ukraine 2035. Who will you be in it?
So if I may, I'd like to turn to Seri for a few minutes and reiterate my question. So I think everybody can see and admire the great progress that Ukraine made during its existence. The question is, how difficult is it being, a business person in Ukraine these days, and what are the kind of biggest struggles that your colleagues and members of your association kind of report to you that they are handling on a daily basis?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for having Ukrainian agenda here in Washington. It is difficult to explain how to do business in Ukraine after 4 years of war, but I'll try. On one hand, we have a complex of such challenges as total unpredictability in terms of everything. Regulation, war consequences, everything. Second, physical security. Every day you can die. It's literally. Third, labor shortage. Fourth, logistic and chain problems. Fourth, energy reliability, etc. So complex of different problems. But on the other hand, we're still functioning as a business, we're adapting, and in many cases we are growing. In order to understand why under such tough circumstances we continue to grow, we should look into the history of Ukraine, into the last 33 years. We went through many crises, revolution, wild 90s, collapse after Soviet Union, etc. So I'm proud really of my nation, because for the last 10, 15 years within the nation, the new generation was emerged, new type of leaders and business leaders. I can just make several examples. Within our business community, we have more than 300 members. Maybe 1/3 of our members already invested and started new businesses related to tech industry. Every third of our member has already a startup related to drones. Two more cases. When the war started, since the war started, after 4 years, 2 of our members became from the scratch, became the biggest producers of drones in the country. They produce together approximately 1.5 million drones per year. It's just from the scratch within 2 years. So we are very creative, adaptive, and we have this hope that everything what we do will have a future. That is why I think Ukrainian business is resilient, adaptive, strong, creative, and after the war, I think we will have an opportunity to demonstrate our results globally based on the experience we are gaining within this tough period. Thank you.
Sure. If I could just add, Sergey mentioned resilience. It's hard to understand the level of resilience that this country has until you get there. I've been in Ukraine several times during the war. My partner spent at least, I think, 4 or 5 times in Ukraine during the war. To see major businesses thrive in the middle of the war, and with respect to the dual-use technology, the level of advancement and expertise that we're seeing in that sector rivals in many ways any superpower, whether it's the United States, China, Russia. To have a country that is basically the quarter of a size or less of Russia, which is considered a superpower, to stave them off for 4 years, where they can't basically go more than a few inches every few months in gaining ground, speaks so highly as to this country. We're not here because we are bears. We are very bullish on Ukraine for a very good reason. Many of the people, both in this room and on this stage, have seen how the advances have taken place, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in mining, or in the dual-use technology. Ukraine has leapfrogged many countries. There's a reason why there are so many U.S., both government and private institutions, that are looking and knocking on the door. The one thing I would say is during the war, there is very much a spread on investment where you can take advantage of, because investments are taking place. And you see, I think in the previous panel, there was a conversation on what was done with the public offering of Kyivstar. That one public offering that came to the United States has resulted in that company now purchasing one of the largest retailers, electronic retailers in Ukraine. So business is getting done, business is moving forward. By the time that war is over, the premiums, the war premiums are going to change quite a bit. The cost of many of these companies are going to go up significantly. So if you're not looking at these companies today, if you're not negotiating with them today, you're missing out. This is no different than looking at startups in the US stock market. What happens is when it hits the stock market, the cost is quite different. So my recommendation is for anyone who has not been to Ukraine, start looking at what the possibilities are, especially in the sectors that they're leading in, on the technology side, on the dual-use tech side. So I'm going to leave it at that for now.
So I think that's a great observation, although we are not kind of in the business of dispensing investment advice here at the AI, but we can have that sort of separate conversation offline if people are interested in it. Hans, so you are kind of operating in this world of venture capital, and it always struck me that successful startup ecosystems tend to benefit from a specific kind of cultural underpinnings. And in Ukraine, and some speakers have already alluded to the fact that there is maybe low trust in government, but seemingly high degrees of interpersonal trust, certain kind of folk libertarianism, if you will, and contrarianism, kind of contrarian kind of mindset that I wouldn't say is exactly reminiscent of Israel in the 1990s, but might have some parallels. Kind of people who wouldn't do as they're told and want to try new things and experiment, and who are resilient and who don't fear failure. Do you think I'm just making this up, or is this something that you see on a daily basis as you work your way through the Ukrainian innovation ecosystem? And perhaps you could also tell us what are the sectors behind the military and dual use that you are the most excited about?
Yeah. No, thank you for the question. Also, congratulations on a lovely event. I don't think that you're making that up. That's certainly something that we see in the space, and I think a lot of that is catalyzed by incredible capital efficiency. So I'd like to lovingly poke at some of my friends in Silicon Valley that folks will raise $5, $6, $7 million and then start to think about what they want their business to be. And then in Ukraine, someone will raise 100,000 and they're already manufacturing and have signed MOUs and large contracts with clients. So the space for error is significantly smaller, and I think that is driving incredible cost efficiencies there. But in the larger investment ecosystem in Ukraine, I think it's bifurcated, which the gentlemen up here have already discussed. One side of it is really venture-driven early stage investments versus investments in larger assets. So those things that are foundational to the economic vibrancy and viability of Ukraine for the long term. So logistics, power generation, things like that. But where we're really focusing in the venture space, what I see as exciting is that the entrepreneurial class and these folks in Ukraine are recognizing the unique advantages, so kind of the silver linings that they have due to the incredibly difficult circumstances of the country at the moment facing Russian aggression. So with that, they have these ecosystems where they can test and push boundaries in exciting spaces that we're just starting to think about in the West. So one area that I'm particularly excited about is med tech and health tech. So in Ukraine, hopefully there's long-lasting and favorable peace very soon. But this is a country that's going to need to integrate hundreds of thousands, millions of soldiers, veterans, civilians who have physical and who are bearing the physical and mental scars of undue Russian aggression. How do you treat those people? How do you ensure that they have the support that they need to not only be happy and productive in society, but to contribute to Ukraine's longer term success? You also see an interesting space developing with AI-enabled companies. So everyone's talking about AI, and there's always speculation in the U.S. of kind of circular financing, how much is real, how much is hype. And I don't think we're going to be seeing new LLMs coming out of Ukraine just because of how capital intensive that is. But what we're seeing is very efficient utilization of AI capabilities. So as Sergey had touched on, there is a labor shortage. So you're seeing very unique ways that teams are leveraging AI to help make up for some of the lack of workforce and human capital that they can attract just because the economy is stretched very thin. So productivity tools, things like that help folks extend what they can do 10, 15, 20%. That is already bearing fruit. And then finally, I want to touch on what a lot of us think about when we think of startups in Ukraine is defense and dual use. So in the defense and dual use space, they have the ability to deploy these new products and innovations in the only real 21st century battlefield, and they're incredibly effective. They're very exciting, but from an investment perspective, there's a difference between what is a product and what is an investable platform. So you have products that are things out of science fiction that are so innovative and so impressive that are making a difference on the battlefield. And those are products and innovations that unfortunately are pretty quickly countered by Russians in 3, 6, 9 months. And then that team needs to go back to the drawing board and try to out-innovate the enemy. That is not necessarily an investable product because it has a short lifespan. However, that's where unbelievable groups like Brave One come in with grants, and I think they're as good as they get. But where you do see investable opportunities is in the platform space. So who's making things on which these products can be built, deployed, and fully utilized? Those are going to be the countries that have unbelievable export opportunities and scalability in long term. And I think that's where you're going to see Ukraine set itself up for competitiveness over the next 5, 10, 20 years.
If I may perhaps step back from the world of startups and venture capital for a second before I open it up to the audience, I'd like to address a question, an open-ended question, essentially, to our two Ukrainian panelists. Sorry, Edward. I mean, yeah, sort of honorary Ukrainian, but
I was born there.
Way too Americanized by now. But it strikes me that when I look at the economic future of Ukraine, the ultimate resource that Ukraine has are its people, and that's true of any country. But I think what brings it into an especially sharp relief in Ukraine's case is the fact that the pre-war population of Ukraine was over 40 million people, and now many of those people live outside of Ukraine. So different estimates of Ukraine's population, you might say, maybe it's 32 million, maybe it's a little bit more, but it's a massive brain drain that Ukraine experienced as a result of this full-scale invasion, and the economists inside of me kind of worries about how you are going to sort of sustain economic growth unless that population comes back and unless Ukraine gets on a more stable demographic footing. Is this something that worries you as well? I mean, obviously, labor shortages exist in wartime, but do you think this is something that might kind of afflict Ukraine's longer-term prospects?
Yeah, this is actually a very good question. I want to make, I think, 4 points in relation to your question. First, we are not in a unique position in terms of all this immigration, immigration issues, yeah? Many countries through the history went through these processes. That is why I think there are decisions. Second, today, the whole global society in a unique position, in a new reality. The whole civilization today functioning as a one whole organism, but we still continue to operate, but the old models try to fix the new problems using the old approaches. So in today's world, we as Ukrainians have 20, 30 million people across the globe. I consider this situation as a unique competitive situation, because if we have strong internal Ukrainian policy, Ukrainian vision, we can use all this diaspora and network as an advantage, because all our Ukrainians across the globe connected to the local society, to the local expertise, resources, etc. So I don't see the problem here. Third, in order to bring people back, from my perspective, there is only one way. We should start the great development and growth in Ukraine. We should demonstrate that Ukraine has a vision. Ukraine has a future. And this is the way how we can bring people back. And fourth, of course, we can attract people from other countries. Why not? So I don't see a problem here. Yes, okay, it's a problem, but it's not a fatigue problem, I would say. Thank you.
And is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I just want to add some story which my Greek grandmother teach me. Fish try to find place, deeper place. People try to find better place. And after the war, unfortunately now, you can see media sphere around Ukraine. Nobody talks something good about Ukraine. We are talking about problem, we are talking about death, about fighting, and etc. But our idea is change mentality of Ukraine. It's the reason why we CEO Club, Sergei, he is president of CEO Club, we together create this project. It's a very important project for the future, which show Ukrainians why they should live in Ukraine, why they can receive more opportunity here in Ukraine, not abroad. And also it's an instrument for foreign investors. We include in this vision a lot of options how they can invest money to receive the best results from this. Few numbers. It's very connected with demographic situation. Total amount of potential investments in defense tech, it's more than $30 billion US. And it's not donation, it's not aid, it's investment with a great internal rate, bigger than 20%. It's a great opportunity. Second, it's energy. Previous panelists talk about energy sector of Ukraine. Ukraine has biggest deposit of natural gas and big deposits in oil in Europe. And it's also opportunity for independence, energy independence of Ukraine from one point of view. From another point of view, it's a great opportunity to increase influence in Europe agenda. We know that in current negotiations, big countries discuss involve Ukraine to European Union in 2027. Nobody know future, but today it's on the agenda. It's also part of big project. Third one. I talked about energy, defense, and third, technology. Today we have more than 1,000 companies, private companies, which produce defense tech, different types. We have more than 300,000 IT specialists. It's biggest amount in Europe, and it's also a great base for create new technologies and new use for us. In Ukraine, we create Ukrainian Chip Act. Each year, Ukraine import more than 40 million chips, different types for weapon. And we, in this year, create a clean room for produce own chips. It also means that Ukraine develop on technology level. Maybe you know, in 2090s, Ukraine produced approximately 40% microelectronics of Soviet Union. We have great base, great history, and we should implement our strong sides for the future, for integrate in external, international supply chain. It's answer on your question, because from these big investments, with implement this opportunity, we attract a lot of people, Ukrainians and from other countries for Ukraine.
And I want to make one more point.
Sure.
As you know, we are all, as a whole society, global society, moving towards AI world. So it means that millions, maybe billions of people will lose their job. We are moving to automation. That is why I don't see here the big problem.
Okay. Let's bring in the audience, if I may. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Yes, please, the lady in the back. And there is a microphone coming.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel. My name is Vladislava. I'm a consultant for the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine on the matter of strategy and humanitarian demining. And I wonder, because of the full-scale invasion and the sheer scale of it, Ukraine is now transforming unusual sectors into business sectors. For example, humanitarian demining is a good example of it, where for the first time since the sector exists, Ukraine has created a commercial market for demining. And that is because what we see in many other sectors, the sheer scale demands a lot of manpower and a lot of specialized organizations. However, the humanitarian sectors are usually not seen as business opportunities for investors, and they're reluctant to engage. On the other hand, since they've been always financed by donors, donors are quite cautious on working with private organizations. So my question here is, how can Ukraine improve the work on recovery sectors, show them as business opportunities, attract investors, and how can Ukraine position itself as a strong partner in recovery globally? Thank you.
Hans. Yeah.
I think the demining perspective is incredibly important. That we've actually looked at some demining companies. They're very impressive. I think that that's also going to be an essential aspect of the critical minerals deal and any type of extraction of critical minerals that you see coming out of Ukraine. So I'm from Arkansas. We had discovered a very large lithium deposit back in 2024. It's really not going to start having meaningful extraction still for another 1 or 2 years. And that's in an incredibly safe place that has no issues around titles, ownership, or demining. So I think that having all those more or less ducks in a row of this is what we need to do to be able to really see the economic potential of Ukraine is going to be critical, and demining has a massive part to play in that. For an investor's perspective, what we have seen is folks saying, yes, that sounds great, I would love to be a part of it. However, what does that look like in the future? There's a lot of speculation. There are a lot of proclamations and promises made at rebuilding conferences for funds with more zeros than you can count. And the details are always a little wishy-washy. And when you ask when they're going to start to deploy, they say, we'll get back to you. Having harder commitments of this is what these funds are going to do and being more prescriptive about this is where they're going to flow, such as demining, for an example, would give investors a greater ability to project out longer term. This is the type of revenue and involvement that we could see in this industry. So I think being able to more closely coordinate with those recovery funds and have those prescriptive, maybe not promises, but at least understandings that it would be a portion of it, would probably go a long way.
Can I add a few words?
Sure.
I try to describe possible roadmap for this answer for your questions. At first, we should have strategy with strong focus. What is our priority? Because today we, like Ukraine, don't have any priority for our development, and like some example for foreign investors. What is base for our partnership? We're talking about critical raw materials and what? Do we create some conditions for attract investments? I'm not sure. I'm talking about tax reform. I'm talking about guarantee for investors. All of these questions, it's open questions, and we should find answer for this question. A little example about critical raw materials. We're talking about lithium. Ukraine also has one of the biggest in the world deposits of titanium. Do you know how much costs a ton of ilmenite? It's approximately $300, 1 ton of ilmenite. From this 100 ton of ilmenites, we can produce final products. For example, here in my head, I have titanium plastine. If we produce such type of plastine, the total amount of these products will be approximately $200,000, from 300 to 200,000. We should create conditions for business, for processing in Ukraine, not for export, and processing in Ukraine. It's our homework from your ministry, from my institution, and we together should create the strategy and conditions for foreign partners.
I'll just add one more item. We were talking earlier about, on the prior panel, on de-risking, political and economic de-risking, and as Anatoly mentioned, the more transparent your democracy is, the more transparent your business sector is, everything becomes that much easier. So if you're talking about any of the sectors that we're discussing, whether it's mining on one side or a different type of mining, removal of mines, all of these pieces become much easier when you have a strong democracy and a stronger economy. And it goes back to the reduction of population. I went to Ukraine a year after the war. I saw many young people returning to Ukraine as soon as the war started because they saw a future, a different type of future for Ukraine. And I think, too, what the panelists have mentioned, if you have a stronger government in Ukraine, a democratic government, a more transparent government, and a stronger, more transparent economy, you will see many people return to Ukraine because they are a very nationalistic people. And Ukrainians want to see a strong Ukraine, especially the ones that have left over the last several years. They want to come back and they want to help rebuild their country. I see that happening. All we need is to see, hopefully, a stop to this war. And I have a feeling that you will be looking at a country that is going to lead Europe out of its economic doldrums.
Well, on that note of cautious optimism, I'm afraid we'll have to bring the second panel to a close. I would like you to join me in thanking our panelists, Edward Mermelstein, Anatoly Amelin, Serhiy Haidaichuk, and Hans Braunfisch. And I would like to invite Ihor Baranetsky from the Ukrainian embassy, who I'm told is somewhere in the room, and who would like to bring us home with a few closing remarks. Ihor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I didn't see you.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here. Amazing audience, and quite a crucial, important topics were discussed. So first of all, I would like to pass you best greetings from the ambassador. She was really eager to be here. The only obstacle was logistics. She just stuck at the airport because one of the flights was cancelled. First of all, I would like to congratulate great teams of American Enterprise Institute and Ukrainian Institute of Future for this efficient cooperation. So now we see the evidence of this efficient cooperation, this amazing event today. And Embassy of Ukraine is really fortunate to have such a strong partner as American Enterprise Institute. Many thanks to Dr. Angela Stant, to Ms. Corey Sheikh, Senator Rob Portman, I just talked to him before, and Delibor Rowe. You and all the distinguished panelists today. I really attentively listened to, especially to the second panel, and I absolutely share the things you raised here today. So, dear friends. You know, it's just 3 weeks before we reach this tragic milestone, already 4th anniversary of full-scale Russian invasion to Ukraine. So you see what happened. Putin overestimated himself, he underestimated Ukraine, and he miscalculated our partners and their unity. So we stay resilient, we continue our fight. And you know what, while talking to many partners, including international financial institutions, they're not really worried about our victory because they know we're going to manage it. And actually, you just raised this topic right now. But what's going to happen after the victory? So that's why we are talking today. That's why we have this meaning of future, planning future for Ukraine, because the war will be over, and we have to keep this impetus. We have to preserve this amazing leapfrog, technology leapfrog, which Ukraine managed to do. We have to preserve this unity within the society and these dynamics for the prosperity of Ukraine and for the win-win future for all our partners who support us today. Well, you see, of course, Russia failing to receive any kind of significant progress on the battlefield, just tried to terrorize our society. That's probably the worst, the most challenging winter. That's why the president declared nationwide state of emergency in energy sector. And we're really thankful not just to our defenders, but to those energy defenders who protect Ukraine and Ukrainians nowadays. It's freezing temperatures. And so, you know, we never have a right to complain to anything, because whenever even I feel a little bit like exhausted or tired, I think, well, in Ukraine, I will do the same job, but without electricity, without water, maybe without heating. So just we have to continue doing what we are doing and thinking about Ukrainians and how they are supporting not just themselves, but they are struggling for all of us. You know, I remember this famous motto from the Annapolis Naval Academy: "Don't give up the ship." So we don't give up. Just like our defenders, we are holding the line during this war. And, you know, in this cruel reality, we really understand how necessary unity is. So again, that's why we have here, that's why we host Ukrainian Week today, this week in Washington, D.C. That's amazing evidence that Ukraine is on the top, still on the top of the list. Well, here is something which has to be done immediately. So first of all, strong air defense capacities for Ukraine. That's what should be supported right away. Second, of course, we still have to preserve and to strengthen sanctions pressure. So sanctions do work. And the more Russia or someone like this Kirill Dmitriev cries that it doesn't, so the more painful it is. It's just another evidence that it does work. So we really appreciate President Trump and his team for preserving the level of sanctions which were implemented before. We appreciate this additional pressure on Lukoil and Rosneft, but we really need more in order to really to force Putin, to force Kremlin to start peaceful negotiations. And I'm just shortly mentioning in addition to Shadow Fleet, in addition to the entire banking system, because as of now only 1/3 of Russian banks are under US sanctions, 1/3. So that means, of course, those are huge banks, but using these mid-sized and small banks, unfortunately, Russia still uses these tools to smuggle, to purchase components, and to continue its war. It's also about Rosatom. So, of course, it's for some partners, it's not really comfortable, it's inconvenient, it's complicated to create pressure on Rosatom, but actually Rosatom, that's like this octopus having affiliated in defense industry, in tech industry. So it's gonna be really, it's gonna hurt to Russia, and probably one of these pieces is gonna force Russia to start peaceful negotiations. By the way, and it's quite important to understand that Ukraine is not some kind of just simple victim or beggar anymore. We have a lot to offer. And again, coming back to nuclear industry, so Ukraine, that's the country which not just plan to construct new reactors based on Westinghouse technologies, but we also the country who can help American businesses to spread on third markets, because we have this successful experience in switching old style Soviet-style technologies in nuclear to switch to American nuclear fuel. What else? So definitely no way Russian assets would really have to come back to Kremlin. You see, I would like to mention just a short example of Romanian gold. In 1919, Russia offered to Romania to preserve its almost 100 tons of gold, just during quite a turmoil during the right after the First World War. So it never turned back to Romania. So just approximate estimates like more than $5 billion US dollars. So just what should be so care with these legislative issues with regard to Russia, as far as for 100 years Russia never never dealt with legal issues. So I just want to attract your attention that we really have to be more creative and more brave with regard of dealing with such a pure evil, which is Russia. So there is dynamics of cooperation, and we really appreciate support from US partners. Just for the last year, we had like 10 phone calls, 6 meetings between the presidents, and some documents are already been fully agreed. So I was a part of negotiation team with the BlackRock, World Bank. So we just right now, we are polishing, let's say, this future prosperity framework for Ukraine. Of course, it's not ideal, but that's a try to see how much funds and where Ukraine needs for its reconstruction, and which is more important, we have to invest in Ukraine right away, not waiting like a year or more, but American businesses, our partners, have to be there right away. Because, you know, I'm always joking that it's easier right now to agree with Kiev than in a couple years to talk to Brussels and to agree with Brussels, because Ukraine is more or less on irreversible path to EU membership. And it's quite important because for many years we were somewhere, like thinking who we are, where are we going to. And this path to EU membership also enforces Ukraine, just creates some frames for Ukraine to work on transparency, reforms, and other important things to provide security and prosperity for Ukraine. And just a couple positive remarks that for the first time ever, US appeared in the top 5 trade partners of Ukraine. It's never happened before. It's during the wartime. Also, we launched this US-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund, and that's a good answer to our priorities, because the fund envisages like 4 or 5 top industries where it's gonna invest. And it's actually the same industry we just talked about: energy, infrastructure, ICT, like AI solutions, emerging technologies, and dual use as well. And looking ahead of this year, we really have a lot to accomplish. We have to accomplish it together. And again, it's like a win-win strategy for Ukraine, for US, for the rest of the partners, because you see good example that nowadays Ukrainian community here with its businesses generate almost $60 billion like sales turnover and revenues in US, on the territory of US, and create up to 300,000 working places here. So whenever we talk about Ukrainians, they're not just resilient, they can adjust to any conditions there are. And of course, we don't think, unfortunately, that 100% of them will come back. But whenever we create this strong feeling of security, whenever we create working places, because it's not just about simple reconstruction. I don't think we have to rebuild something like Soviet-style mines or factories which were already not compatible. We have to concentrate on the most modern tracks, and we have to create modern workplaces, because we can find some sources, some donorship, and let's say rebuild some kind of town. Maybe people will have some financial support to stay there for a couple months, but what's next? So that's why we have to create these competitive, profitable industries. That's where we have to invest, and that's what's gonna encourage people to come back and to work in Ukraine. And Anatoly mentioned the trust to our government. It's really important. I remember during the first or second year of the war, I talked to German politicians, and they told me that it's so important to create this level of trust. So that's why our people not just have to think about like elections or their social control like a right, but as a responsibility. Why, for example, Scandinavian countries are so successful? Because there is a really high level of trust in government. So it's like both-way track. It doesn't mean that just government has to do everything for people, or people have to complain all the time about the government. It's just a mutually dependable mechanism, very fragile. And that's where we have to think very seriously about our contribution to this, everything of this. So once again, I would like to thank you very much for hosting this event today. I would like to draw your attention that Ukraine, it's not just about war, it's about future, it's about mutually beneficial projects, and only together we can pave this pathway to peace, predictability, stability, freedom, and prosperity together. So thank you once again. I will stay here. Whenever you have any questions with regard to embassy, just let me know. And thank you once again for hosting this event. Thank you for American Enterprise Institute and to Ukrainian Institute of Future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. We are delighted to welcome this big crowd and nicely Ukrainian heavy crowd to AEI, and I hope it's a beginning of a long and beautiful friendship. There are other events as part of the Ukraine Week in DC I would welcome all of you to talk to Pavlo Ungurian in the hallway. We have light refreshments ready for you, so feel free to stay, linger, chat, and network. Again, many thanks to our panelists on the second panel and on the first panel as well. Many thanks to our friend at the Ukrainian Institute for the Future, and I look forward to seeing many of you back at AEI again. Thank you.